Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in San Francisco, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in winter-like Houston, Texas.
And today is one of our climate episodes. And so we're going to actually be talking with Rebecca John, who is a journalist, was a producer of the BBC, and is now a lead investigative researcher for the Climate Investigations Center. She's recently published an article based on some new documents coming out of archives going back as far as 70 years about the fossil fuel sector's attempts to cover up climate change. Rebecca, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on today.
And I want to maybe start off because you had this article that came out in DSmog blog recently. You have a series of articles that were in DSmog blog, but there's a recent one with some new revelations. And maybe you could just start off with telling us about the most recent revelations in your latest article.
Yeah, sure. So I think in that latest article, I've got a series of 2 articles. There are 3 major headlines. Firstly, the earliest documented moment that Big Oil was warned about the climate risk of burning fossil fuels, which happened in November 1954, and again in March 1955. So that's 70 years ago. Specifically, my investigation and the documents I found show that the West Coast's most powerful oil and gas interests being warned by a geochemist at Caltech that burning fossil fuels was likely causing an increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and that this increase with reference to climate might in future be, quote unquote, of considerable significance to civilization. And of course, we're talking about this week as at the moment, multiple fires are still raging in LA. And one of the fires, the Eaton fire, is burning near to Pasadena, which is just a few blocks from Caltech. So this climate warning from 1954 is hitting particularly close to home right now. Yes, secondly, the evidence shows what appears to be the oil and gas industry's first use of a front group to influence public opinion on the issue of air pollution and to fight against air pollution regulation using a front group specifically designed for that purpose. So the documents show that in late 1953, California's most powerful oil and gas companies formed and funded the very innocuously named Air Pollution Foundation as a vehicle for sponsoring and publicizing research that would downplay or dismiss the industry's role in the region's growing smog crisis, and intended by the industry to prevent regulation of its activities. So in this way, like 1950s LA can be seen as ground zero for a tactic that has since become one of the key elements of the oil industry's playbook. That's funding a third-party community front group to sponsor and publish research aimed at downplaying or denying the harms of burning fossil fuels. Since the 1950s, oil and gas companies have repeatedly used front groups to influence public opinion. And the documents I show really reveal that in terms of the oil and gas industry, this can be traced as far back as a tactic to the 1950s in LA. But yeah, the irony is that it was through one of these research projects commissioned by the Air Pollution Foundation, that the Caltech project I was just talking about, that WSPA, the Western States Petroleum Association, and its oil and gas company members. So we're talking Exxon Mobile, Chevron, BP, ConocoPhillips, as well as Shell, SoCalGas, and Southern California Edison. These companies, as part of WSPA, were informed in late 54 and early 1955 of a much greater danger arising from the use of their products than local air pollution, which of course was global climate change. And then thirdly, the revelation also that in 1954, Big Oil sponsored climate science at Caltech. And through the Air Pollution Foundation, none other than Charles David Keeling, his earliest measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide, we know from internal Air Pollution Foundation documents that this work was sponsored by the oil and gas industry And the foundation sponsored it in the hope that carbon dioxide samples might show that the common practice of burning backyard trash and not fossil fuels was responsible for causing the city's emissions that were resulting in the smoke. I always say, spoiler alert, it was the fossil fuels, but Keeling's work very quickly showed that fossil fuels were the main source of the carbon pollution. But it also showed that there was this baseline level of CO2 across the Western United States, which was significant because up to that point, it was assumed that CO2 levels would vary according to the topography of an area. So whether it was forested or not, were there trees to absorb the CO2. But what Keeling found was that everywhere he went, CO2 levels registered at a steady level of around 310 parts per million. And it was on the basis of that work and that realization that Keeling went on to get interest from the US Weather Bureau to begin his experiments on Mauna Loa, which were measuring long-term CO2 levels. And that resulted in the visual depiction we know as the Keeling curve. So again, this research showed that very early on, the oil and gas industry were there at the very beginning of what we could call modern-day climate science.
Was he publishing this, Keeling, was he publishing these findings, or were they mostly just internal?
Yes, they were internally delivered to the Air Pollution Foundation. I've seen the Air Pollution Foundation records where some of his reports were submitted, and then the very first proposal was published by the Air Pollution Foundation. So they published Caltech's research proposal, the initial one, which included the carbon dioxide warning. So that they published that in 1955, so very early on. And however, there were some changes at the very top of the Air Pollution Foundation in the spring of 55, and the industry started exerting more control over it. And after that point, what the foundation published was much more sparing and was related much more closely just to do with the types of pollution that were being found in the LA area immediately, and were limited in information and did not reference again the climate significance. So I haven't seen, it's possible, I think that there may have been some Caltech publications, but I haven't found them. I've only found a report in Keeling's own files that clearly was published somewhere, but it doesn't reference what that publication was. And this is
So even though he made these discoveries, he wasn't, they weren't being spread out widely.
No, not they weren't being spread out wide at that point. It was some point later, in 1963, that he released the first findings of the Keeling curve. But yeah.
And the Air Pollution Foundation actually started out initially as a somewhat benevolent organization before it was, is that correct?
No.
Investigating oil.
So the Air Pollution Foundation was set up in late 1953 in response to the LA smog problem. And what we know about it is that we know that representatives from leading members of the Western States Petroleum Association, as it was then known, the Western Oil and Gas Association, were present at the original meeting that took place at the city's exclusive California club, where it was decided that a foundation would be set up through which local industries would fund research projects to shed light on the air pollution situation and to try and find a solution to the smog problem. So in terms of the kind of exterior, it was very much reported as a citizens, but in fact, what we know from internal Air Pollution Foundation records, memos that I found, the Western States Petroleum Association at least very much intended it to operate as a front group. We know that they wanted it to be right from the outset protective, and that their funding was predicated on the fact that it served as the research department for the oil industry, and it should publish findings that would be accepted by the general public and by regulators as unbiased. So I think right from the very beginning, it was intended as a kind of as to be protective to the oil and gas industry.
And Lauren Hickok, who was a early president of the Air Pollution Foundation, was actually out of science. He was a chemical engineer who had done a lot of their dirty work, I guess you could say.
Yeah, he's a really interesting character. So in 1954, as the Air Pollution Foundation, it had some money and it was putting itself together. The board, whose members included several powerful figures from California oil and gas companies. So the president of SoCal Gas, the president of Southern California Edison, and the president of Union Oil, which is now Chevron. They were all members of the board, and they also held key positions within the foundation on its various committees, research committees, etc. So the board appointed its first president, who was, yes, as you say, this man named Lauren B. Hitchcock, who was an East Coast chemical engineer and a World War I Naval Aviation Corps veteran. He was recruited with the assistance of an APF, a Pollution Foundation trustee who had ties to Standard Oil, which is again now Chevron. And he probably seemed like a safe pair of hands from the industry's point of view for someone to run a front group for them because of his background. But things didn't really go according to their plan, because Hitchcock rolled out what was actually a very ambitious program of research that seemed to be genuinely engaging with the smog problem, not simply working to keep the oil industry and the refineries out of the regulatory firing line. He started looking at all aspects of the pollution problem. He called for investigation into refinery emissions, and he also spoke out about the need for increasing air pollution controls across the state and more like state-funded research. So this really seems to have irritated and alarmed the leaders of the Western States Petroleum Association, because in addition to that, he also published what was the foundation's first technical progress report, which included the Caltech research proposal in full, containing its warning about carbon dioxide and the Earth's climate stability. So all of these things were happening in the early 1955. And in April 1955, what must have been a very dramatic moment for Hitchcock is the documents show the whisper leaders calling Hitchcock into a meeting, again at the California Club. This is clearly where the important business deals took place.
Lots of cigars and scotch, I'm sure.
Yeah, lots of cigars, lots of scotch, white Gielan tablecloths, everything. And yeah, I can picture them all like pulling up to the valet parking in their huge gas guzzling 1950s cars. Yeah. But yeah, so thanks to a memo that Hitchcock wrote after the meeting, we know that it was over this lunch that the industry big shots made it very clear that was not what they expected in return for their financial contributions. And Hitchcock describes how these whisper leaders told him they intended the foundation to be, quote unquote, protective, and that their funding was predicated on the fact that it would serve as the research department for the oil industry, and that Hitchcock himself would be the research director, and that they should publish findings that would be acceptable by the general public, who were really suffering from the smog problem at the time, and in fact had reached such a peak that people were talking about, citizens groups were forming, talking about looking at legal remedies. There were protests in downtown Pasadena. Thousands of people gathered to protest the smog problem, called for shut down the refineries. It was a really alarming prospect from the industry's point of view as well, that what was going to happen to them. So they really, at this point, I think, you can see in the documents, they try to take things back under their control. And yeah, so Hitchcock, things changed really after that moment.
And we start seeing much more federal regulation on things like clean air, clean water, clean air in the late 60s, early 70s. I think it was in the early 70s where Nixon passes the Clean Air Act. But what government regulation was happening in 19 California? Is it municipal, state, and did the WISPA actually have influence over? I'm assuming WISPA had influence over that at the time as well.
Yeah. So it is so interesting how a lot of the time California is the front runner for all this, a lot of pollution regulation in the US. So first of all, in response to the smog problem, which many people thought when the first episode occurred in 1943, it was so dramatic that it was reported in the press at the time as an enemy gas attack in the context of the Second World War. So it really was quite an extreme event. And the authorities soon responded to that. They created the very first air pollution control district within LA County, where specific rules applied, what you could and couldn't do, what could be burnt, what couldn't be burnt, etc. Now, that was innovative at the time. It didn't solve the smog problem. It didn't. Of course, the scientists were discovering more and more as time went on. And in line with that, the regulators worked to keep up with the science. So by the early 50s, another Caltech scientist, Dr. Ari Hagensmith, had put forward and proved the hydrocarbon theory of smog, showing that the key pollutants responsible for the smog problem came from hydrocarbons. And so the authorities then started acting accordingly to develop regulation in line with the new scientific findings. So at this point, the LA County were continuing to work on expanding their regulatory control. But that was something that the industry constantly fought against. And in some ways, it was pretty simplistic. So one of the solutions was to just shut down refineries in the peak smog season. That was something the authorities fought. But again, actually, the industry fought, but they lost. The authorities succeeded in putting that into play. But it's really very much an evolving picture during this time. I think the first 1955 was the first federal act apportioning a certain budget for air pollution research. And then the first Clean Air Act of 1963 comes along, but that was much later. Yeah, not later than this period. So it's really, this case is, this era is one of and the regulatory authorities beginning to try and regulate this problem, which is increasingly becoming a national problem. So again, during this period, the Western Oil and Gas Association, WSPA now as it's known, had its Smoke and Fumes Committee, which it developed in 1947 to deal with the smoke problem, or to deflect the problem away from the industry. And they were responsible for one of the key members of the California oil industry was responsible for setting up the Stanford Research Institute, was a key driver behind that, which was one of the first ways that WSPA sought to address the smog problem by funding research at this industry-sponsored research institute, paid up industry research that it used quite extensively to try and deny that it was responsible for the smog problem. And again, all this stuff is happening. I was quite interesting. The Air Pollution Foundation is funded in late 1953, which is exactly the same time as the Tobacco Industry Research Committee is being founded in New York, pioneered by Hill and Knowlton. And they're both using the same strategy, the same research-based strategy to deflect industry responsibility for harms, whether that be air pollution or the connection between cigarettes and cancer. And that strategy, this research-based deflection or denial or doubt strategy, is something that, of course, we see being employed in increasing intensity throughout the latter half of the 20th century.
You said that there were actually protests in LA against the smog. So there's stuff going on, which is more than I was aware of. How widespread was the knowledge of this, though, nationally? Was media covering it, saying, hey, we may have a problem? Obviously, the energy industry took it seriously enough to start a friend group and fight this. Were they concerned that this was becoming a bigger problem than they wanted? Or?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That they absolutely were, yes. Locally in LA, it was being covered extensively. There were smog reports all the time, and the owner of the LA Times had a great beat reporter on the air pollution story who was incredibly well informed that they covered it. It was it was part of everyone's everyday life. And the smog affected every aspect in LA at the time. But yes, there were smog events in other cities, big industrial centers. Pittsburgh, for example, had very poor air quality, and there were toxic smog events that actually late 1962, over the Thanksgiving weekend, killed people in New York, which was one of the reasons the Kennedy administration pushed so hard for the Clean Air Act of 1963. But yeah, just to backtrack to this period, even by mid-1955, there were growing calls across the US for regulation, actually based on the LA model, or using the expertise that regulators and scientists had built up in LA to roll that out across the US. And what's interesting is you see the head of WSPA's Smoke and Fumes Committee, so the original chairman, a guy called William L. Stewart, who in fact was one of the people that hauled Hitchcock over the coals during that lunch meeting at California Club. He was the head of the Smoke and Fumes Committee. He raised money to help get Stanford Research Institute off the ground. His grandfather, I think, was one of the founders of Standard Oils of California, so he had a great oil industry pedigree. And he realized that this fight was something that was going to spread nationally, and that the industry were vulnerable nationally. And he spoke at a conference of the American Petroleum Institute, so the oil and gas industry's national lobby group. at a conference at their refining division, which he was vice president of. And he said, this is in the mid-50s, he said, look, we need to take this thing very seriously. He said his warning was, and these are his words, the policeman is coming. And he warned his colleagues at the API that they needed to take this seriously. And then the API institutes its own Smoke and Fumes Committee, of which William L. Stewart becomes chairman. So he's across both what's happening in LA and California through his continued membership of WISPR, but he's also appointed the API's chairman for the Smoke and Fumes Committee, which had a national remit. So I think that is a very clear indication that they were looking to fight that on a national scale. And that's something that in the late 50s, they rebrand, they get some better PR advice. They start calling themselves the Air and Water Conservation Committee. Sounds great, doesn't it? Lovely. And they start really appearing at more national level during the hearings of the Senate Public Works Committee on what would eventually become the Clean Air Act. There's a very strong presence by American Petroleum Institute, accompanied by the Western States Petroleum Association in some cases, and lots of other industry groups like the Manufacturing Chemists Association and others.
Every time you say smoke and fumes, I think of smoke and mirrors, which is
yes, very
which I think is very apt. You actually, because we've done some shows in the past on advertising and disinformation, for lack of a better word, and so you talked about how this is happening at the same time that the tobacco industry is doing similar things. Did we see public relations firms, advertising firms who are working for both? Is it the same people who are coming up with these PR strategies, these disinformation strategies?
Yeah, yes, great. That's fascinating. I looked into this. So first of all, the PR for the Air Pollution Foundation itself seems to have been quite heavily directed by Union Oil. They seem to have been quite interventionist in their approach to how things were run at the foundation and influential. But they contract out to a company called Robertson Hannigan, which I think had the Coca-Cola account. They were a fairly large PR company, and they had an office.
Holy grail of advertising account, right?
Right, exactly. So they represented them for a short period, and they were doing all the usual things: press campaign, outreach to communities, sponsorship of projects, a speakers bureau, targeting women's groups, all sorts of things. That was their whole, getting speakers on the radio, possibly even television. But they had this whole PR program that was pretty effective. And then the Air Pollution Foundation, I think for budgetary reasons, when you look at the minutes, it seems it's mostly financially concerned. They got what they needed from them. It's unclear, but they stopped that contract. And then very shortly after that, though, Robinson and Hannigan was acquired by Hill and Knowlton. Yeah, I looked at both the Robinson Hannigan details that I could find and the Hill and Knowlton archives, and it seems that Hill and Knowlton inherited everything from them, the people and the expertise, but it doesn't look as if the Air Pollution Foundation called on that external PR assistance after this point. I think, however, what does that show? That these tactics, this strategy is very much in the water or in the air at this time. It definitely, there's always that sort of PR arms race that goes on. It's like once one company starts doing something and rolling something out for one company or one industry, everyone else joins suit and copies. So yeah, it would be interesting to know. That's something I definitely intend to look into a little bit more as well about this. Let's not underestimate the brilliance of the internal company PR as well. They had a lot of experience going back, especially companies like Standard Oil of New Jersey. They had fought many battles in terms of government and public opinion. Yeah, they'd already built up a fair amount of expertise themselves.
I'm sure against labor too.
Definitely. Yeah, that's where it all started, I think. Definitely against labor.
When these PR programs began, what was the approach? Because so much of, I think, the debate over these climate issues revolves around people being responsible, right? You need to recycle, stop littering, drive your car less, and it focuses on individuals. Did they start that? Was that kind of the approach already when they began these programs, like in the 50s and early 60s?
Yeah, let me think about that for a moment. I think what was evident in the PR program was that they definitely, first and foremost, just wanted to get the brownie points for sponsoring air pollution research, whatever that was. It was like, keep calm and carry on consuming fossil fuels. We're doing the research. We'll get there in the end. Don't worry. I know the smog is awful for now, but this is a long-term problem. And we'll probably have it solved in about 5 years. That's what they said at the beginning. It's exactly what they were saying by the end of it. So they were definitely pushing the horizon back on like public outrage, which was just trying to get that. I think it was emergency measures to simmer it down. They certainly didn't want people to scale back their use of fossil fuels. So they actively shut down the original research project that Hitchcock had authorized, which was looking at how public transport might alleviate the pollution problems in LA. And I think they just absolutely, one of the clearest aims, which was in fact after the oil industry came in and critiqued the foundation's program in April 1955, it was the one thing that they said they thought was worthwhile the foundation should do, and their primary purpose should be to act as a first-class public information bureau. So they wanted to have careful control over the facts of what was being published about air pollution, what the research was showing, and they wanted to control that and publish it in a way that they were happy with and in a way that best reflected back on them, I think, was that foremost aim. I mean, there were also a few funny things in there, which is like they were at one point sponsoring a project. This is a late stage Air Pollution Foundation project that would perhaps blame personality characteristics or personal genetic traits for people's reactions to the smog in the same way that the tobacco harm psychologists, right? To say
eugenics and breathing the smog. Wow.
Yeah, it was like, we're going to look whether personality traits affect whether people's eyes water when they come into contact with smog. And they were proposing putting people in smog chambers to test this out. I don't know if it ever actually happened, but because the tobacco industry did psychological profiling, blaming individuals, right? Yeah, I know. So that was definitely something that they were considering at one point.
Just to shift to climate a little bit, there's you found evidence that they were aware of the impacts of the burning of fossil fuels besides just smog as far back as the early mid-50s. And did their disinformation PR strategies around that, could you talk you talked about some, but could you talk about that a little bit more? Like how that becomes a blueprint for how the industry still operates today?
Yes, very much. And that's another really interesting aspect of this research and these early documents. This whole story is like a microcosm of what would happen later. So after that meeting, the California Club Showdown in 1955, what is the industry taking a much more influential role over the foundation. And you see the President Hitchcock being sidelined. Ultimately, he would resign. You see the research projects being scaled back. And after that point, none of the subsequent progress reports published by the foundation or any of its subsequent publications, in fact, none of them mention the climate dimension of carbon dioxide pollution. Instead, they refer to carbon dioxide as innocuous, quote unquote. That's what a couple of them call carbon dioxide, innocuous. And while they do update on the local kind of impacts of Keeling's work, they say that 2/3 of the local carbon pollution is created by fossil fuel emissions, right? They say that's what the Caltech research is showing. They don't refer at all to the greater climate significance of what Keeling, the potential greater climate significance at that stage, right, of what Keeling's work was showing. So that's one way carbon dioxide goes from being potentially of significance to civilization, 6 months later is being described as innocuous. So externally, that's what we can see. We also see that in 1958, at one of the very first air pollution conferences held by the US Public Health Service in Washington, D.C., so it's a national conference on air pollution, we see a representative from Shell Oil, a guy called Charles Jones, who had this incredible CV. He had previously been a member of the Air Pollution Foundation's technical committee. He'd been cited by Whisper as one of their air pollution experts, and he was also the executive secretary of the American Petroleum Institute's Smoke and Fumes Committee. So he's somebody who likely should have known about this could have known about this, ought to have known about it, right? He stands up in front of this national audience and tells everybody that carbon dioxide is harmless. And that was at a conference where earlier that same day, and one of the keynote speakers had actually talked about, this is 58, had actually talked about the climate significance of carbon dioxide emissions and potentially it causing global warming and causing the polar ice caps to melt. So this is not something that is not being discussed. It's being discussed on the same day of this conference. And there we have this like top industry air pollution expert describing CO2 as harmless. So that's what we can see from the outside. And that does seem to foreshadow what happened later, say in the 1980s, where Exxon was informed by its own in-house scientists that, yes, when asked to research the connection, the scientists said, yes, indeed, fossil fuel generated carbon dioxide is causing a greenhouse effect, which is likely to have these climate impacts before too long in the relatively near future. What did Exxon do? Made cuts to the research. And of course, very famously, its representative went on to deny the existence of man-made climate change. What we don't have from this early period, we don't have the internal documents where we don't know what was saying behind the scenes, right? We don't know if they said, oh, this is really bad for us. Why the hell are our guys publishing this report outlining the climate risk from burning our products? This is ridiculous. Why are we paying this foundation to publish this? Shut it down. Somebody make it stop, right? We don't have that memo. We can see that's what happened in the external actions, and we know what took place in that meeting with Hitchcock. But it's possible that those documents exist. We keep looking. You never know what you're going to find.
There was a few years ago a really good 3-part series on PBS. Was it a Frontline? I can't remember about that, going back to the 70s. A lot of these, I'm assuming a lot of universities got money from these oil institutes, right? Because currently I teach the University of Houston. We have an energy, which they use the word energy, right? Institute, and there's a lot of money there. The oil companies subsidize it. A lot of professors who they find useful are part of it. But when these began in the 50s and 60s, were there other professors who were starting to create this field of climate science? Were they teaching courses in it? Were they writing about it? It seems it's a fairly new study, which in the last 30 years is obviously all over the place, but was it already, did you already have kind of an awareness and a consensus that this has to be studied further by that time?
Yes, there were very much. I think interestingly, there was a Yale scientist called Eugene Hutchinson, who in fact was teaching his students about the possibility of a fossil fuel generated greenhouse effect leading to climate change in the 1940s. And that was in the East Coast. On the West Coast, what Caltech was doing, was very interesting because they were using the latest developments in radioactive isotopes to be able to analyze pollution. And using this technology, they could analyze the molecular structure of pollution particles and say where it came from, i.e., was this like ancient fossil material caused by the burning of fossil fuels that had been dug out of the earth deep down, or was it caused by more newly minted carbon? So, for example, like trees that had wood that had been chopped down that had been absorbing, had been created more recently. So that was something very new. And Caltech's geophysics department was doing very interesting work on that front. Also, at the same time, we had the Scripps Institution in San Diego, which was where the climate scientist Roger Revelle was based. And he was looking at how much carbon dioxide that the oceans could absorb, because scientists already knew that the oceans were absorbing a fair amount of carbon dioxide. But his great revelation came a bit later in 1957, I think, where he realized that there was this sort of buffering effect where the oceans could only absorb up to a certain amount, and then they would begin to release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So it was this growing understanding during this time. There were also international sources of climate science, centers of climate science. So Sweden, also in the UK, where I'm based, the University of East Anglia, a scientist called Callender had done a lot of earlier work on this. So this was something that was growing across the world, particularly in the US at this time, however, and on the West Coast.
Talking about that, where we start seeing this actual climate science begin to discover things. You have a couple of other articles that you published a while back on DSMOG around politicians at a federal level knowing about being warned about the climate. about the impending climate crisis. There was a conference in 1963, which I think maybe made it to the Kennedy administration. And then there's, I believe, memos that you found or that have been found that about the Johnson administration also being made aware of that. Could you actually talk a little bit about, there's where Jimmy Carter just passed away, and there's a lot of media around him putting solar panels in the White House and him being aware of the climate crisis, even though it was denied by his successor. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Kennedy and Johnson and what you found of that.
Yeah, sure. Interestingly, yeah, in 1963, actually, Keeling, Charles David Keeling, Dave as he was known, was invited to take part in a symposium on the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere, hosted by a philanthropic organization called the Conservation Foundation in New York. This was an organization that was funded by the Rockefeller family and other New York society figures. But I also actually found that it was also funded by some oil companies. So Standard Oil of New Jersey, now Exxon Mobile, Standard Oil of California, now Chevron, and Richfield Oil, BP, also sponsored this group called the Conservation Foundation, which later became the World Wildlife Fund or the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. It has different names, I think, in different places. But
You call them both wolf in certain circles.
oh, okay, yeah. So interestingly, the instigator of the conference was actually Eugene Hutchinson, the Yale scientist I just mentioned, who had been interested in potential. He was really interested in ecosystems, so he was really interested in the potential climate impact of burning fossil fuels within effectively a closed ecosystem, our planet. And he thought it'd be a good idea to have some of the foremost experts gather, discuss the CO2 problem, and put together insights from their respective fields and also priorities for what should be done about it and future research and what the next steps could be. So that took place in New York and I think it was in March or April 1963. And the head of the Conservation Foundation, who was a guy called Samuel Ordway Jr., who was a lawyer, but he was also related to one of the founders and biggest investors in 3M, the Minnesota Minerals and Mining Company, which is also kind of plastics and chemicals. And also, so there's all these interesting overlaps between industry, oil companies, the knowledge about carbon dioxide right from the very beginning. You can't separate them really, the history shows. Anyway, so he had a stenographer present and they recorded the proceedings. And out of this conference, they published a small book, a slight volume, which recorded the discussions that took place between not only Charles Keeling, but Gilbert Plass, who was at Ford Motor Company, a Johns Hopkins University physicist, who was very interested in the climate impacts, actually. He wrote more than anyone, and actually published in the mid-50s about potentially the ability for the greenhouse effect to melt polar ice caps, and started exploring a bit more about what that might look like for the planet in real terms. And also a Swedish climate scientist called Erik Erikson, as well as a few other people. In the report, they made statements, for example, saying that the carbon dioxide situation might have considerable biological, geographical, and economic consequences in the not too distant future. And it talked about how humans were adding millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. And it talked about, probably thanks to Plass, what those impacts might look like. And it focused quite heavily on the rising temperatures and increased rainfall and melting ice caps and rising sea levels. And this was the sort of main focus. But it also cited the fact that there was uncertainty about what the climate impacts would be. And that was something to be worried about. That was not a reason to do nothing. If anything, that was a reason to do more, because it was not yet known how bad this was going to get. And the stakes were so high for this civilization potentially that it was really something that had to be looked at sooner rather than later. So we know that 700 copies of that report were printed and they were mailed out to persons of interest and certain some members of the foundation's existing mailing list. We don't know exactly who received a copy. I haven't found the mailing list as yet, but it's likely, given that those oil companies I mentioned before, Standard Oil, New Jersey, Exxon, Chevron now, and BP, their predecessors may have received copies in that they were sponsors and contributors to the foundation. So again, that's another moment when they may have been notified of the severity of this issue. But what we do know is that one of the copies by May 1964 had found its way into the Air Pollution Division of the Public Health Service Department. It was part of the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, and it was responsible for the Air Pollution Division. This is prior to the EPA. It was responsible really for formulating air pollution policy and the regulations on the federal level and for apportioning the federal air pollution research budget. They had a copy, and the Conservation Foundation report, into which Keing science fed, Placer's science fed, the sort of latest up-to-date thinking on CO2 was there. That report was really cited as the main reference for the Air Pollution Division's own report to the Johnson administration about what priorities should be on a national level in terms of the objectives for atmospheric research. There's a stepping stone at getting closer into the sort of heart of government. Yeah, by 64, it's definitely been read by the federal department looking at air pollution and is actively kind of priorities and influencing what the US government think are the important areas for greater research and greater understanding at that stage.
The EPA and Energy Department weren't formed until the 1970s. Which federal government agency dealt with this issue prior to that?
Yeah, that would be the Department of Health, Education and Welfare.
Okay.
Yeah. And its public health service, and within that, the air pollution divisions. That's a three-step. It was they were very hardworking and they made some incredible strides, but it didn't have the national recognition of something like the EPA when that was finally created. Yeah, and I guess the next stage is what you were talking about, the Johnson administration. One of the other documents I found when I was at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library in Austin was a memo that landed on the president's desk on January the 13th, 1965. So it'll be the anniversary coming up next week, which is the first, I think, documented moment that, at least within the Johnson administration, I don't know for sure about the Kennedy. I haven't seen a document that spells out the climate risk from burning CO2 to Kennedy. There may well be something. Yeah, that also happened. But this is the first one in 1965, as far as I was aware at the time, of a US president being informed about the connection between carbon dioxide emissions and climate. And it's there on a list of priorities for Johnson's environmental task force, what those priorities should be, the areas it was most centered on. And in that list of 10 or 12 items, climate change is up there. It's really important. It's an important priority in 1965, which it speaks a lot because it shows how this issue was being dealt with in a very kind of professional, matter-of-fact way before it got so intensely politicized.
The other climate news out of California, besides the terrible fires going on in Los Angeles, is that Exxon Mobile has filed a SLAP suit, a strategic litigation against public participation against the California Attorney General, Rob Bonta, the Sierra Club, a number of other environmental groups. Do we see any, going back to the 50s, but do we see any efforts by WISPA, Big Oil, to silence people who are trying to bring this science to light, to bring this issue to light through litigation? Do we see that in this early period, or are they just mostly focused on putting out disinformation and controlling like regulatory political processes?
Yeah, you see them trying to shame people. I wouldn't go far as say smear campaign, but they were pretty horrible to Ari Hagensmith. They didn't attack him with any slap suits, but he wasn't bringing any litigation against them. But I don't see that early on, this like the litigious strap. Of course, they were lobbying lawmakers in Sacramento and more locally the LA county authorities. That was going on constantly. But No, as for lawsuits, I haven't seen any as far as I know. I don't think there were any. Yeah, that's the plastic suit I think you're referring to, where the staff suit, they put that on the
Yeah.
plastics. Whisper are not cited in the California lawsuit against the climate deception lawsuit. Exxon Mobile are, of course, but also Whisper have been cited named as a defendant in an Oregon lawsuit. Multnomah County, Oregon, has named Whisper as a defendant specifically for its use of front groups, actually, to manipulate public opinion. I think the wording is something like conducting a stealth campaign through the use of front groups in order to lull consumers into a false sense of security about continuing to purchase and use its members' products. So it's interesting that Whisper, the organization that was one of the key drivers behind this Air Pollution Foundation and the use of it as a front group, is currently named as a defendant in a lawsuit in Oregon for its use of front groups on the climate issue in the present day.
I have one more question. I don't know if Bob has any additional questions. My final question is, since you've been publishing these articles, have you faced any backlash from Big Oil about the things that you've been putting out, that you're digging out of the archives? My other question is, have you faced any backlash to anything that you've published?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, not really, no, thankfully. I think partly because this work is so grounded in the documents, always referring back to the archives and the industry's own documents as much as possible. That's laying out, as far as I see, what happened. But yeah, no, at the moment, no. Partly, maybe it's because this work is outside of the statute of limitations, right? It's such a long time ago. It's not seen as a threat. I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully not, is my response to that.
I kind of wonder if the oil companies even care anymore, because when I watched that PBS Petroleum Broadcasting System, right, it was quite well done. And they had documents from the 70s. They spoke to engineers. And it seems to me the oil companies could have intervened to stop or something. They did. I think, I'm not sure they care anymore. I think they figure we'll just do what we want.
Yeah, that's possible too. Yeah, it is possible. You would hope that they care. You would hope that on a personal level, some of the individuals within them would care. Yeah, I don't know if there was any backlash to PBS. I know I worked on a series in the 2000s where we filmed with a North Slope, Alaska oil-filled whistleblower, and who said that basically BP were cutting costs and that lives were being lost and the environment was being damaged, and that this was a problem that was running throughout the company. And we put that program out as a warning to try and raise awareness of the fact that BP was really cutting back and that they were risking accidents happening. And, of course, unfortunately, history that would relate that we now see that there were oil spills in Alaska, explosions at Texas City refinery, and then the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, which were all caused by BP's lack of just negligence, I think is the word that the judge used in the case of Deepwater Horizon. But yeah, we had quite a lot of backlash from that. We had one of the senators from Alaska, Ted Stevens, wrote to the head of PBS complaining about standards of journalism, which is a classic industry move. It's like the first thing, if you don't like it, say it's really poor journalistic quality, complaining that we hadn't interviewed enough people on their side or enough. Yeah. And in fact, we had asked everybody for an interview. We begged BP dozens of times for an interview. They wouldn't talk to us, wouldn't let us in. We'd talked to everyone. We'd gone around DC knocking on loads of doors, asking for people. We'd found somebody in Alaska. We had found a few people. I think the chairman of the Republican Party in Alaska agreed to speak to us. Probably that was the most, and the head of the Alaska Oil and Gas Association. But luckily, we had actually even asked Ted Stevens for an interview, and his own office had turned us down. So we were able to come back and defend ourselves with that. But I remember he signed off the letter to PBS saying, "Is this any way to treat a friend?" Which was an insight into that the world of politics, Alaskan oil and gas, and broadcasting.
I'm going to wrap it with that. Folks, we've been talking with Rebecca John, who is a researcher for the Climate Investigation Center, and just published an article called Revealed: Big Oil Told 70 Years Ago That Fossil Fuel Emissions Could Impact Civilization, and DSMOG blog. You should check it out. We'll also put it in the show notes. And you're listening to the Green and Red podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to this on one of the many audio platforms we're on, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And just as, because we'll be publishing this before the actual event on January 16th in Berkeley, California, we'll be having our first ever Green and Red live event at the Berkeley Unitarian Church with Bob Bazenko, Dennis Bernstein from KPFA's Flashpoints, and Nora Barrows Friedman with Electronic Intifada. Rebecca, it's been great having you on. This has been a great episode. Much appreciate you joining us for our first episode of 2025, actually. So
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you.
yeah, thanks. And everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.